Join me for a conversation with an author who has written more than 50 novels.
Welcome to DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show. Level up your RPG campaigns by filling yourself with stories and knowledge. Explore topics from archaeology to film history to writing to literature and much, much more. This is DiceGeeks.com Tabletop RPG Show.
Welcome to the show. My name is Matt, and I am your host. This is the podcast where we learn how to become better game masters and role players by filling ourselves with stories and knowledge. I thank you so much for joining me again this week on the podcast. I have an amazing interview coming up in just a second. But first, if you don't know who I am by now, my name is Matt Davids. I write the Books of Random Tables book series. Those books are geared to cut down GM prep time so game masters can have more fun at the table. You can find those books at Amazon.com, DriveThruRPG.com, and my own website, DiceGeeks.com. Just type in the Book of Random Tables and you will find them. Also, I have a book out called Dungeons. It is 51 dungeon maps with descriptions and random tables, so you can just throw a dungeon into your campaign whenever you need one. The paperback is on Amazon, and the hardback is on DriveThruRPG.com, and plus there are Kindle and PDF versions there as well. And like I said, I have a great interview today, so here it is. My guest today is a prolific author, having written novels for series like Star Trek, Stargate, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Farscape, and many others. Keith R.A. DeCandido. Keith, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Good to be here.
It is my pleasure. Thank you so much for coming on. When did you realize you were a writer?
I honestly, I don't remember a time when I wasn't interested in storytelling of some kind. Mm-hmm. My parents are librarians, and they read to me as a kid and then gave me stuff to read on my own when I was old enough to do that. And I was always interested in that and always interested in creating stories. The first thing I actually wrote was when I was 6. It was this little book I did on construction paper at summer camp called Reflections in My Mirror. I still have it. It's terrible. But that desire to make stories was always there, to some extent or other. So, I can't remember a time when I didn't want to be a writer. There are other things I also considered at various points, including acting and possibly, any number of other things. There was a brief period where I was really hoping I would be the second baseman for the Yankees. That didn't last very long. And
well, I had hoped I would.
Any number of other things, but being a writer was always one of the things I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And something I was writing regularly things in high school and in college, and I had stuff published in the high school newspaper and the high school literary magazine, and I worked on one of my college newspapers, which was an award-winning publication called simply called The Paper. That was what we called ourselves. We were very straightforward. And I not only wrote for them, I was an editor there as well, but first the arts editor and then the executive editor. And that kind of led to my becoming an editor when I first graduated college, which was how I made a living before the writing career took off. So.
Okay. Yeah. And I had kind of wanted to be the catcher for the St. Louis Cardinals, but that didn't work out either.
It was fine until I joined a little league team where we finished 9th in an 8-team league. We were really bad, and I kind of dashed all those hopes.
Yeah. But fortunately, you found something else.
Yes.
And I had mentioned in the intro that you're prolific. I believe it's more than 50 novels, and then
at this point, yes.
Yep, and then countless anthologies and short stories, as well as comic books and other things like that.
I'm nearing 100 works of short fiction at this point. So.
Wow. No, that's
plus comic books and a whole lot of nonfiction.
Okay. Wow.
I've been writing about pop culture.
Yeah.
Pretty regularly, actually, even longer than I've been writing fiction. My first published work was in 1989 for the Comics Journal. And then I did some stuff for the Comics Journal. I wrote for Library Journal, for Publishers Weekly, a bunch of other magazines and such. And these days I've been writing for a lot of essay collections, and most particularly for Tor.com, which is the award-winning pop culture website that Tor Books runs. Mm-hmm. I've been writing for them for 9 years now.
Yeah, and actually, that's how I really kind of discovered some of your work and had really started following that. I was reading some of your articles on Star Trek: The Next Generation,
right?
And reading about your rewatch and that, and so that's where I kind of really started seeing your name kind of appear, kind of over and over again. Now, just mentioning all these novels and that, and all these, the comic books and the criticism and, pop culture and all of these things. I'm just kind of hoping that you live in some kind of time warp where you have 38 hours per day, because if we have the same time per day, I'm feeling really unproductive. If we both have 24 hours, I feel very unproductive.
No, I just, I've given up on such outmoded concepts as sleep. I tend to have a lot of things going at once. It's a challenge sometimes to juggle the time. I do the best I can. Sometimes I'm successful, sometimes I'm not, but it can be pretty chaotic. But I've been doing it I have been a full-time freelancer for 22 years now.
Wow.
I gave up my office job on May 1st of 1998, and I've had a couple of part-time jobs since then, but I have not been a full-time office worker in any of those 22 years, and it's not easy. It's incredibly difficult and incredibly hard and very frustrating at times, but I love it, and I wouldn't trade my life for anything. And it's something I have to keep working at and keep juggling 8 million things at once. But it's great.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, maybe it's the circles that I kind of run in, but it seems like a lot of people want to be writers, and,
yes.
And like I said, maybe it's just the circles I run in because, since I am a role player, a lot of role players tend to be, want to be authors, if not published authors already.
There's certainly overlap, between being a game master and being a role player also, and writing. I mean, there's still the Venn diagrams overlap quite a bit. You're still in some senses creating a story.
Yeah. When did you discover Dungeons and Dragons?
High school. I joined the Chess and Special Games Club, which was originally the Chess Club, but we realized we weren't actually playing chess. We were doing everything else. So they changed the name. And my best friend in high school, a fellow named John Drew, with whom I later did the Chronic Rift public access TV show and then the Chronic Rift podcast, the former in the 1990s, the latter in the late 2000s. John introduced me to D&D, and we started up a game as part of the part of that particular after-school club, and it stuck. I haven't done as much gaming recently just due to a severe lack of time.
Sure.
That is the downside of having so much to do and having all that stuff going on at once, is that the time for things like RPGs just does not present itself, unfortunately. Yeah. But through into my late 20s, I was gaming pretty regularly.
Okay. Oh, that's great. And I always find that interesting because a lot of the people that I interview who are novelists have usually always played Dungeons and Dragons to some degree, especially if they're kind of a certain age, or, so I just find that interesting. And then, of course, even I find other people who who are playing Dungeons and Dragons always kind of start at some point talking about writing something or creating something or telling a story in some way. But kind of just picking up, I said, a lot of people seems like they want to be writers. What is kind of do you have any kind of standard bit of advice if somebody is out there saying, oh, I want to be a writer?
You have to. I have several actually, but one in particular is you have to, if you want to do it professionally, and that's an important caveat, because if you're just doing it as a hobby, this advice does not apply. But if you want to actually become a professional writer who is paid for your work and whom people will pay to read your work, then you have to treat it like a job. And treat your writing, even if you're not actually getting paid yet, to treat it as if you're doing a job. The act of submitting your work for publication is like going on a job interview, and you have to manage your time the same way you would manage your time in an office job. This is work. It's difficult. It's incredibly frustrating at times. But you have to treat it with the same respect for your time and energy and need to get stuff done that you would if it was something that you were instructed to do by your boss at your job. Okay. Also, it's really important to finish what you start. The ratio of short stories and novels that have been started to ones that have been completed is about 8 billion to 0.5. It's way easier to start a story than it is to finish it, and finishing it is a major step, and one that so many people don't make.
Yeah. No, I think that is absolutely great advice. And I wish I would have learned that years ago, a couple of those things years ago. Because yes, treat it like a job is very important. I think it's easy not to, because usually people are relying on something else for their livelihood. So it's easy to treat it as a bit of a hobby or something like that.
Yeah, but then you treat it like your night job or your second job. If you want to be treated like a professional, you have to behave professionally.
Yep. Yeah. No, totally agree. And then absolutely. And then finishing things, of course. Yeah. I mean, if you don't finish something, what's, obviously it's never gonna go anywhere. What do you feel, or how do you feel about kind of the self-publishing kind of revolution that we're in the middle of?
It's great. It gives writers more options. I mean, when I first started, if you either your book was published by one of the big publishers in New York, or you were screwed. Actually, I think what's of more benefit is the small press revolution. The rise of smaller presses that I'm working with a couple of them myself, and I think that is even more beneficial. But self-publish. My only concern, I mean, when I started, self-publishing was the sort of thing you did when you were it was just a vanity press. It was just it wasn't something you did if you wanted to be taken seriously. Now, of course, it's a different thing. The tough part there is, I said you have to treat your writing career like a job. When you've decided to become a professional writer, you have decided to become a single proprietor small business who is in the business of selling your art. If you decide then to self-publish, you have decided to become a completely different single proprietor small business that is in the business of investing in art. And these are, and you have to keep them separate because, and it has all the concomitant time sinks that comes with running a business. And you're basically running two businesses at once. You're running the business of you, the writer, and of you, the publisher. This is not to say you can't do it. Lots of people do it successfully. But lots more people do it unsuccessfully. It's not an easy way out, if you know what I mean. It's still fraught with the same difficulties that writing is. But overall, it's a good thing because it gives you more options. It gives you more ways of getting your work out there.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. And I know exactly what you mean, because obviously that is what I do. I write and then I self-publish, and and when I talk to people, I don't think, it's when writing and doing the layout and all of these things for your book when I tell them that's 20% of my work that I have done, and that there's another 80% that is marketing and things like this, usually their eyes kind of glaze over a little bit, because the production of the book is a lot of work. But then just to think, well, you've done 20% of your work, now you have 80% where you need to market and all these other things, can be a little overwhelming. But it has opened up so much in the world, and
it's had the same effect that the rise of basic cable did for television. Because again, when I was growing up in the 1970s, you had 3 networks and a couple independent stations in each city, and that was pretty much it. Now there's hundreds and hundreds of options, and it gives more artists a chance to have their work be seen, and it means that there are different standards for success. You don't have to be a huge mega hit in order to be successful. A New York publisher needs to sell a very large number of books in order to be a success. A self-publisher or a small press does not need to sell that many. So if your book only appeals to a limited audience, that's still not a bad thing. In the same way that a show can be a hit on a cable station with numbers that would get it canceled on a network, but it can still find its audience. Same thing with books. The small press and the self-publishers allow books to find an audience without the need to be mega successful that a large publisher needs in order to survive.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that is something that tends to get overlooked sometimes, that people don't realize when you're self-publishing something, you can appeal to a small, loyal audience, and you can do just fine instead of putting something out there and and expecting it to be like a huge hit. Macmillan needs huge hits, right? Something like that. A small press or somebody who is self-publishing through their own their own name, can do very well with a small but loyal audience that wants exactly what they're putting out.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now, I had mentioned that you had written for a number of these different series, Star Trek being one of the most prominent ones. When did you become a Star Trek fan?
Pretty much from birth. My parents watched the original series when it first aired in the 60s, and I grew up watching the reruns, the syndicated reruns, which is where Star Trek really found its popularity throughout the 1970s. I can never remember a time when I wasn't a Star Trek fan. That it was always, and it's wonderful to me because it's always been part of my fanish life going back to when I was a kid, and since 1999, it's also been part of my professional life in some form or other. Every year since then, there has always been something Star Trek of mine that has come out, whether it's fiction or nonfiction. So it's and I'm very pleased about that, because I have always loved Star Trek, and I'm thrilled to see that it's basically enjoying a renaissance right now with the various shows on CBS All Access and the upcoming show on Nickelodeon. So it's great. And I'm enjoying the hell out of it. But yeah, no, like I said, I have been a Star Trek fan pretty much all along.
Yeah. Now, so what did that then feel like? Say being such a Star Trek fan, and then being able to write and publish in the universe. What did that feel like?
Oh, it's great. Because I wanted, in addition to devouring the 79 episodes over and over and over and over again, and seeing every movie when they came out opening weekend, I also read the comic books, and I read the novels, and I read the James Blish adaptations of the original episodes. So, and I never imagined myself really, being a TV writer. That never entered my head. I always wanted to write books. But one of the things I wanted to do was be one of the people who wrote Star Trek books. So, particularly in high school, I was an avid reader of everything that came out. I still remember the thrill of picking up new books from the bookstore and all sorts of wonderful books by the people who were publishing. Simon & Schuster was publishing throughout the 1980s when I was in high school, and then to actually have I still remember the thrill when I first had a Star Trek comic out in '99 from Wildstorm, and then when my first novel came out, which was Diplomatic Implausibility in early 2001, it was just like, holy crap, I've actually written a Star Trek novel. I've written more than a dozen since then, and it's still an absolute thrill. And I'm really honored that I've contributed a lot of different things to Star Trek lore over the years. They're not necessarily major parts of the lore, but they're there. And they're things that I did and that I established that people still like and read and admire, and that's wonderful. It's a great feeling.
Uh-huh. What are some of the your most proud things that you've added to the Star Trek universe?
Oh, that's easy. In 2004, I wrote a novel called A Time for War, A Time for Peace, which was the final book in a 9-book series that basically chronicled the year leading up to Star Trek Nemesis. It was designed to set up Nemesis retroactively, and also to set the stage for the post-Nemesis fiction that Simon & Schuster has been doing since 2004, up until the debut of Star Trek Picard earlier this year. Screen Star Trek wasn't interested in the 24th century. Everything we've gotten since Nemesis has been either 22nd or 23rd century stuff. So Simon & Schuster was given free reign to do whatever the hell they wanted with the 21st century. And part of what we were doing with the A Time 2 series was setting up the status quo for the post-Nemesis fiction. In A Time for War, A Time for Peace, I had a presidential election because in the previous book, which was A Time to Heal by David Mack, the Federation president resigned. And so I wrote an election and created the character of Nan Bako, a woman from Cestus 3 who ran for president, won. And then I wrote a novel called Articles of the Federation, which came out in 2005, which was basically her first year in office, dealing with, among other things, the fallout from Nemesis, because in Nemesis, the Romulan Senate was turned into pixie dust by Shinzon, and then Shinzon himself was blown up. So the Romulan Empire is in a total shambles at this point. And that's just one of many different things that she has to deal with in her first year in office. I thought that President Bako would be in those 2 books and that was it. She might get mentioned once or twice as, a nice little tribute, and that would be it. She wound up becoming a major supporting character in the various 24th century novels that were done after Articles. She was in the Destiny trilogy by David Mack. She was in the various Typhon Pack books. I wrote her in A Singular Destiny. And she became this major supporting character. And then, and the book's a couple of years old now, so this is a spoiler, but there was a miniseries a few years back called The Fall, where the inciting event that drove the miniseries plot was President Bako being assassinated. And on the one hand, I was kind of peeved that the character I created was killed, especially since she was created partly in tribute to my great-grandmother who died in 2003. But the fact that she was important enough to have her assassination be the inciting event of a major, what turned out to be a New York Times best-selling event, was awesome. That was my character, not actually my character, but a character that I created and established the personality for and established the background of. And I don't own the character, CBS does, but she's still a character I came up with, and that she became this major supporting character was wonderful.
No, I can only imagine. Yeah, that sounds fantastic. Now, how did you? I guess I should go back a little bit. How did you first then start publishing for Star Trek? How does a writer get in there and start publishing in the Star Trek universe?
In this particular case, it started with knowing the editor. Really, I first met John Ordover when he worked for Tor Books as an assistant editor in 1990. Greg Cox introduced us. I had met Greg through the Chronic Rift, the public access show that I was doing from 1990 to 94. We did, the Chronic Rift was basically a talk show about various genre issues that me and some friends did in the early 90s. And we had various people in the science fiction industry as some of our panelists. Greg was one of them. And Greg introduced me to John, and we became friends. And then John moved from Tor to Simon & Schuster to work on the Star Trek publishing line. And he had hired me to do a couple of little bits and pieces of work, like some cover copy here, some research there. And then after I had published 4 novels, I published 5 novels, I'm sorry. I did a movie novelization. I did a Buffy the Vampire Slayer book, a Spider-Man book, and 2 Young Hercules books. And then John said, hey, how'd you like to pitch a Star Trek novel? And I said, well, duh. And I did. I pitched him a novel. He rejected it. But this is in 1999. He came back to me and said, I just got the script for the Deep Space Nine finale. And it ends with Worf being made Federation ambassador to the Klingon Empire. How'd you like to write his first adventure in that part? And I said, that sounds wonderful, because he knew that Worf was one of my favorite characters. So that's what we did. And he and I plotted out the book. And it all snowballed from there. Because I had that contract already in place when Jeff Marriott was putting together comic books for Wildstorm. When they acquired the comics license, he gave me the chance to pitch, because I was doing that. And mine wound up being the second one published, called Perchance to Dream, which is a Next Generation miniseries. And then John and I worked on developing the Starfleet Corps of Engineers series, which was an ebook only series that went from 2000 to 2007. Simon and Schuster was very much ahead of the game when it came to ebooks. Mm-hmm. And I give them credit for that. They were on that bandwagon long before it was hip. And they had all infrastructure already in place once the Kindle was launched. And we did a series of original ebooks, a monthly series called the Starfleet Corps of Engineers, which I helped develop, and then I wound up editing while I was there. And it all, like I said, it all snowballed from there. That from that first project, and people kept asking me to do books, and I kept doing them until I didn't. There's always changes in editors. John left in 2003, and then Marco Palmieri, with whom I'd also been working on various Trek projects, including probably 2 of my best novels, Articles of the Federation, which I already mentioned, and a book called The Art of the Impossible, which I'm still consider one of the best novels I've ever written. Those were done for Marco. Marco was laid off at the end of 2008, and then the new editorial regime evinced no interest in hiring me, which is not unusual. This every time there's a change in editors, there are some writers who suddenly get more work, and there are some writers who suddenly get less. Everybody has people they're comfortable working with. So, but it was a fun 10 years being part of the stable of writers, and I'm still doing projects here and there. I'm doing stuff currently for Star Trek Adventures, but from Odysseus. And I'm still writing about Star Trek for Tor.com. So.
Yeah. And like I had mentioned, I had kind of come across your rewatch of TNG because I grew up on The Next Generation. It came out when I was 13. Of course, I loved the original series, and I had watched it in reruns. But then with the TNG coming out when I think I was 13 when it premiered, I was just able to kind of grow up with TNG, and I loved it. And since I got you on the line, what's a favorite episode from TNG of yours?
I have a lot.
So do I, actually.
I don't think I could narrow it down to one.
Okay.
Certainly family.
Okay.
Which I'm always, and this is both me as a writer and me as a consumer of fiction. I'm always more interested in what happens after the big event rather than the big event. Mm-hmm. Aftermath stories are of more interest to me personally, and family was a wonderful example of that.
Because that took, just for context for some listeners, that took Picard after he was assimilated into the Borg, and now he is back, but he is dealing with kind of the emotional trauma of killing so many Starfleet officers and things like that.
Yes. And there are also, a subplot with Worf. We get to meet Worf's human foster parents, and Wesley also gets to see a recording his father made when he was a kid. Yeah. And it's a wonder, there's no major conflict or anything. It's just these characters as people recovering from a major trauma. The Best of Both Worlds 2-parter was a major event. Mm-hmm. And that's not something you just shake off and then go back to your regular lives afterward.
Spatial anomaly.
Yeah. So I love that one. And I love the Klingon episodes generally. In particular, I loved Reunion just because it was so well put together. Mm-hmm. That was the episode where Kalar is killed, and despite the fact that I love, and it's a testament to how good the episode is that one of my favorite characters is killed, and I still like the episode.
Yeah.
And also Rightful Heir, not Rightful Heir. I'm sorry. I did like Rightful Heir. I like that one a lot. That was the one where the clone of Kalis comes back. But my the one I love in particular is the second part of Birthright, which is basically entirely a Worf episode. The rest of the crew is barely in it, and he's discovered prison camp with Klingons on it, where Klingon children have been raised with no knowledge of their heritage, and he basically teaches them their heritage. And I love that one just because it's such a wonderful examination of Klingon culture and of Romulan culture for that matter. And it understands the importance of storytelling to a culture in general and to Klingon culture in particular. And I just love how well that was done. So those are some of my favorites.
Okay. Okay. Well, yeah, I have to agree. I really enjoy Family as well. And then Reunion is a phenomenal episode. And it is, I think you were saying, a testament to the character or whatever, but like Kalar, she's only in like 2 episodes and she was amazing. Yeah. Just absolutely amazing character. And also brought to life by an amazing actress, of course, too. But, so yeah, those are some of my favorites too. And when I was reading some of your articles, it was interesting. Some of your thoughts, I know, some kind of go along with some of my opinions about Star Trek. And then of course, I'm sure they diverge somewhere along the line, but, I did think you had been mentioning that like Worf certainly had become kind of one of the parts of the backbone of the series, you know, of Star Trek: The Next Generation. And I thought that was just so true, that his, it was, in kind of retrospect, it was a very good thing that he kind of stepped out of the shadows instead of just being a kind of a costumed extra or something in the first season, to really become a fully fleshed out character that really kind of formed part of the backbone of the show.
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, the show it was obvious from the conception of the show that they intended the big 3 to be Picard, Riker, and Troy, and it wound up being Picard, Data, and Worf, just because partly due to the skill of the 2 actors in question, and partly due to just the fact that people gravitated to doing stories about them. You know? Yeah.
Yeah. And I think that's so true. I know we hear obviously about Patrick Stewart being an amazing actor. And of course, Brent Spiner is an amazing actor, but I think people do leave off the fact that Michael Dorn is an incredible actor. And,
and he became a much better, you could see how much better an actor he became as it went along too. He was a little stiff in the first season, but as he got more to do, and as the show progressed, he just, and not just in Next Gen, but also, you know, on DS9, was just amazing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I usually, when I think of my favorite episodes, usually I think of, well, I mean, it's hard to get away from the best of both worlds, like both of those. I mean, because those are very good, and they really kind of represented. I don't know what it was, certainly a pinnacle of Star Trek at that time, when it just pulled kind of everything together and really took it to a new level, just with the storytelling and things like that. And it was just those were always good. I
still remember sitting on the couch in the living room with my friends. We all got together to watch that episode. It was in New York, it aired on Saturday evenings at 7:00, and I had a bunch of friends over to watch it, and I remember just being devastated at the conclusion, because this was 1990. There really wasn't an internet, and we knew that like the finale was going to involve the Borg, but that was it. And then seeing Picard turn into a Borg, and then Mr. Worf fire, and then fade to black, and we all screamed. It's like and this was before. It was before season-ending cliffhangers became a regular thing. Yeah. It's in fact because of that episode that that season-ending cliffhangers did become a regular thing on television. You saw it very rarely on TV prior to that. I mean, you did. In fact, that particular cliffhanger was almost a point-for-point rerun of the finale of the second season of Blake 7, the British show. But it's hard to really describe how incredibly devastating that was. Yeah. You know, 30 years ago.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree, because I had a similar experience, although I didn't have friends over, because it aired. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and it aired at 10:30 p.m. on Saturday nights. So yeah, no friends over, but well, sometimes, but not all the time. And I know absolutely it was just like, what is happening? And then I think, if I'm remembering right, that like some of the magazines and stuff at the time, like Starlog and some of the stuff, I think did the studio put out some things, I think, that was like, we didn't know if Patrick Stewart's contract had been renewed, or Riker's contract, or Jonathan Frakes' contract had been renewed. And you're like, is the show, like, when it starts next season, is it just going to be a different cast? Are we going to have a different captain? There
were rumors that Stewart might not be coming back. So that added to the craziness.
yeah, absolutely. So it was. I just remember it being awesome. Just my memories of the time were just being incredible. And then I do love, usually any of the Klingon episodes. I was usually a fan of the Klingon episodes. I thought they really kind of nailed it in Next Gen, kind of making them this honorable samurai type race almost. And I thought those were fantastic.
I usually refer to them as Viking samurai.
Yeah. Oh, that's pretty good. I like that one, Viking samurai. Yeah, because it does kind of combine elements from those. And I also do like some time travel stuff. So I like Yesterday's Enterprise.
Oh yeah,
is a really good episode. And that, but well, I mean, I could just ask my wife. I could talk about Star Trek all day. So, and sometimes, she likes Star Trek too, but sometimes she gets tired of it. But now, in addition to Star Trek, you have written for Stargate. You have written for, you had mentioned Buffy. You had written for Farscape. Did you do comic books for Farscape as well?
Both prose and comics.
Okay.
I wrote the first Farscape novel that was published here in the States by Tor.com, which is called House of Cards. I did a couple short stories for both the magazine and the role-playing game. And then in 2008, Boom Studios got the rights to do a Farscape comic that would continue the story beyond the Peacekeeper Wars, and I worked with Rockne O'Bannon, the show's creator, to do those comic books, which was basically season 5 of the show, more or less. Wow. That ran for 3 years.
Yeah,
and that was tremendous fun. That was one of the most enjoyable projects I've ever done. It's not often you get to work with the creator of the show to further the story that way, and it was fantastic. That was one of the best projects I've ever worked on.
Wow. Yeah. And now you also wrote a novel for Andromeda, yes. Which listeners to the podcast probably will say I talk about Andromeda too much. But I loved Andromeda. I have interviewed Robert Hewitt-Wolf, who was the creator of Andromeda. I interviewed Ethel Ann Bear, who was a writer on the first and second seasons. I've interviewed the hosts of the Andromeda podcast. I talk about Andromeda quite a bit. Just for my own curiosity, how did you end up writing an Andromeda novel, and did you like the show?
It actually came about due to the Farscape book.
Okay.
Ironically, since we were just talking about that.
Yeah.
Tor Books also had the rights to do the Andromeda novels. They published Farscape, and the editor of the Andromeda books, who was also somebody that I had known personally for quite a while, knew that my Farscape book was well received and said, "Hey, how'd you like to write an Andromeda book?" And at the time, I hadn't actually seen the show. I'd seen like maybe one episode. So I basically started. I said yes, absolutely, I'd love to, because when an editor says, "Do you want to write a book about X?" you say yes, and then figure out how to do it later. But what I hit upon, and partly this is because Tor had done something similar for their line of Earth Final Conflict books, was to do a prequel, basically show what Becca Valentine and the Eureka Maru and what Tirana Asazi were doing in the 9 months or so leading up to when they fished Dylan Hunt out of the wormhole. We got hints of it. But I was fascinated by what they were doing before they joined Dylan's kooky Commonwealth Crusade, as I called it. And so I pitched that, and they went for it. And that was great. That was tremendous fun. To get to fill in the backstories of the various characters. And Andromeda was ahead of its time in terms of online interaction with the people producing it. There were online bulletin boards while the show was on the air that several of the people involved in the show, including Paul Woodmansee, who was the science consultant, and the writers Zach Stentz and Ashley Edward Miller. This was their first major TV gig, and the two of them have both gone on to tremendous careers since then. But they all, Thor, X-Men First Class,
Yep.
The Flash, bunch of other things. Zach's currently working on a Jurassic Park thing, I think, for Netflix. They're both, and they're both doing great. And that was they both worked on Fringe together in the Sarah Connor Chronicles.
Oh yeah.
And but they interacted with the fan base much more. It's type that it's more common now, but it wasn't at the time. And that was great. I got to, they were very helpful in answering some questions I had while I was working on the book, and they've remained friends in the years since. And that was wonderful too.
Mm-hmm.
But it was a great project, and it was also my first hardcover, as it happened. It was published and then hardcover, so that was my first one.
Okay.
And I had a lot of fun with it. Robert Hewitt Wolf did some wonderful world building for that show, and it was great fun to work in it.
Yeah,
especially without the crutch of Andromeda, the ship Andromeda itself, which was it was a much more hard scrabble thing with Becca and the Eureka Maru trying to eke out a living.
Why is that more appealing?
It was something different. It was the Eureka Maru that we saw in the show always had Andromeda as a backup. And it wound up being basically a glorified shuttlecraft for the Andromeda. And I just thought there was more. There were interesting stories to tell about what life was like as freelance cargo carrier / smuggler / whatever that was hinted at. So
yeah, and I guess that's one of the reasons why I kind of do have really fond memories of Andromeda. And then just a few years ago, I finally went through and I got to see all the episodes. I hadn't been able to see like the 4th and 5th season up until just a couple of years ago. And you were mentioning the world building. I think I was just kind of blown away by some of the different world building in that, especially in Robert Hewitt Wolf's time on the show in the first season and a half. Just some of the depth that was there was really just something I wasn't seen on TV since Star Trek, the Next Generation or something like that, and that I really enjoyed some of the things that they were doing that. Words that were becoming popular in our culture, like drones and things. Like they just used computers and they used the ship to do things that you knew that the Enterprise probably could, but the Enterprise never did any of those things. And just like having the ship has mechs that they can drop for ground assaults and different things like that. Right. And you were just like, well, that is just like, it was just some super cool things that he built in. And then,
the technology was a more realistic extrapolation. It didn't depend on the more fanciful technology that you see on Star Trek, where basically, well, there's warp drive because we invented it because it's magic. The science was much more grounded on Andromeda, and much more based on actual current scientific theory, as opposed to, well, we need to have them go faster than light, so they have a warp drive, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It was a nice change of pace from what we were used to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I really enjoyed how. And actually, when I interviewed Robert Hewitt Wolf, he talked about how the Nietzscheans were, he didn't want to just like have the Klingons again. So he took them and he took them in I thought a very unique, at the time, certainly a very unique direction, and gave them their own kind of thing that you can say, well, a Nietzschean is definitely not a Klingon. They're very distinct, where they could have been easily kind of just lumped into the kind of the same group, but they certainly were not.
Yeah, no, I love the Nietzschean culture was one of my favorite aspects of the show, and it's one I got to play quite a bit with in my novel. The title of the novel was Destruction of Illusions, which comes from a Friedrich Nietzsche quote. Okay. And both plots have a great deal of stuff with the Nietzscheans. Obviously, the Tyr half of the plot does, because it's about Tyr, but the Becca half of the plot does also. It has her getting involved with I can't remember the character's name, but the Nietzschean that James Marsters played.
Telemachus Rade.
No,
the first one.
That was
Harris Rade.
That was Steve Basic's character. Bolivar something.
Charlemagne Bolivar.
Charlemagne Bolivar. Thank you.
Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah, he's only in one episode, but it was indicated in the episode. It wasn't stated outright, but you could interpret the episode that he had met Becca before, and I ran with that and was given the okay to run with that, and had her basically getting involved with Bolivar on a previous mission, and that was the other half of the story. So there's lots of Nietzschean politics and stuff in Destruction of Illusions, which is part of the fun of doing it for me.
Yeah. No, that sounds great. Sadly I have yet to read any of the novels, because when I interviewed Ethlie Ann Vare, she was a writer on the
yes. Yeah,
she wrote one of the novels as well. So I need to pick those up at some point and read those, because I am. Yeah, I know it sounds a little strange, but I do need an Andromeda fix every once in a while. But and like I said, I probably talk about it too much. I'll have to talk about something else at some point. I'll have to get a new show or something like that to talk about. But since you have written all these different series and that, I was just wondering. I have interviewed a few other authors who have written some tie-ins, media tie-ins. I think one actually, Richard White. I think he wrote he wrote for the Corps of Engineers, I think.
Yep. Yeah, I've known Rich for far longer than either of us are comfortable admitting out loud in public. Rich is an old friend.
Yeah. So just like writing media tie-ins, does obviously you can't change Riker's middle name or something like that when you're writing. Do you find it restrictive, or do you just find it fascinating just to play in that sandbox?
The latter. I don't find it restrictive at all. No more or less than when you're writing your own series. I mean, I'm working on the 6th novel of my fantasy police procedural series, and I'm restricted, so to speak, by what I've already established in the previous 5 books and 15 odd short stories. But that's what you do when you've got, a universe. You still have to make a story. You still have to have a story with a beginning and a middle and an end. When you're writing a tie-in, there's less world building you have to do, because that part's already been done. And sometimes you do get the opportunity, like when I was doing the post-finale Farscape fiction, or when Simon & Schuster was doing 24th century Star Trek books that took place after Nemesis and after DS9 and Voyager's finales, then you sometimes do get the opportunity to make changes, or to move things forward in a way that you wouldn't be able to while the show's still on the air. That doesn't happen very often. I mean, most tie-in fiction doesn't outlast the source material. Star Trek and Star Wars and Doctor Who were like 3 exceptions in that regard. They were still able to publish books when there wasn't any new material. That is not the case with most other tie-in lines. Buffy also was able to do it. Buffy and Angel were. And every once in a while, you'll get something like the Farscape comics that I did. But most of the time, you have to put the toys back in the sandbox when you're done. But that doesn't restrict you at all. I mean, not in any meaningful way. Like I said, you still have to have a story with a beginning and a middle and end. And there's plenty of opportunities for storytelling in all these universes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, just maybe one last big question. We mentioned at the first part, a lot of people want to be writers. Or it seems like that to me. I know I've seen stats that say something like 81% of all people want to write a book once in their life, or something like that. Whether that's fiction or not, I have no idea. But
wanting to write a book and actually writing a book are two wildly different things.
Yes, it's
haven't actually tried. But
because in the same stats that I've seen, it's like 81% say they want to write a book and less than 1% do. So
sounds about right.
Yeah. if you're sitting down to write a novel, like how do you know you have like an idea that's big enough to fill a novel? Does that make sense?
Well, I always plot out my novels first.
Okay.
That comes of coming out of media tie-in fiction, because when you're writing licensed fiction like this, you have to plot it first and get it approved before you start writing.
Okay.
So, if I'm writing the Star Trek novel, I have to write a plot outline for it, give it to whoever's editing Star Trek fiction, and they pass it on to the CBS licensing department, which currently is a guy named John Van Sitters, who's wonderful, by the way. And John then he's responsible for approving or not approving that. And once it's approved, then you start writing the book. That's how my career started, doing media tie-ins almost exclusively. And so I'm used to plotting it out. So yeah, you sit down and I sit down and write a plot, and usually that tells me whether there's enough there to fill a novel or not. It doesn't always work out that way. I remember one of my Buffy the Vampire Slayer novels, a novel called The Deathless, which came out in 2007. I wrote a plot outline for it, and then I sat down to write it, and I realized I was 2/3 of the way through the plot outline and only about less than halfway through my word count. And I realized I needed to add a subplot. So I did, and I went back and it was fine. But initially I was like, oh crap, I don't have enough story here. And you don't always know, sometimes that will happen. You'll go your way through and you realize, oh geez, I don't have enough story here. And sometimes you wind up having more story than you expected. It's not a perfect process all the time, but usually the outline tells you, and every writer has their own process. You ask 10 writers what their process is, you get 12 different answers. You find the way that works for you, and take it from there.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Keith, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Where can people find your original books as well as some of your tie-in books? They're all available from all the usual online book dealers: Amazon, B&N, Kobo for ebooks, iTunes also for ebooks, the various bookstore websites like Powell's and such. Anywhere you can find them. They're most of them are available in some form or other. I also have some copies of my books that I sell autographed copies of. If you go to my website at DeCandido.net, it is currently a very primitive website. By the time this airs, it may actually the new version may be live. I'm working on refurbishing the website right now. As we record this, by the time this actually goes live, the new website might be available. But either way, if you go to DeCandido.net, that has links to all the different places you can find me online. It'll have links to, at the very least, an Amazon page that has the search results for looking for Keith DeCandido, and same thing on Barnes & Noble. You can... So that's the best way to do it. If you want to cyber stalk me in any way, it's pretty easy. I regularly post on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, and I maintain a blog on WordPress that I update pretty regularly. You can read my stuff on Tor.com. I'm in the midst of a rewatch of Star Trek Voyager. Like you said, you see my rewatches of Next Generation. I have actually done rewatches of the original series, The Next Generation, and Deep Space Nine. I'm in the midst of a rewatch of Star Trek Voyager, and I've also been reviewing every episode of the new Star Trek shows as they come out. So as each episode of Discovery, of Short Treks, of Picard, and of Lower Decks come out, I've been reviewing those for Tor.com as well, and I'm going to keep doing that for, Strange New Worlds when that debuts, and Prodigy when that debuts. And then probably when I'm done with Voyager, since I will then likely dive into Star Trek Enterprise, simply because if I don't, it'll be the only series I haven't covered, and that would be silly. So yeah, I'm going to be hopefully writing for Tor for quite a while. I write other things for Tor as well. I did from 2017 to the beginning of this year, or beginning of 2020, I did 4-color to 35mm, the Great Superhero Movie Rewatch, where I rewatched every single live-action movie based on a superhero comic book. And that feature will continue to be updated every 6 months to a year or so with new movies that have come out. It's for in mid 2020, I reviewed both. I did a rewatch of both Bloodshot and Birds of Prey, as well as a 2000 movie adaptation of Faust, which I had missed on my first rewatch.
for the end of 2020, whatever actual. As we record this, we haven't reached the end of 2020, and by the time this goes live, we will be in 2021, so we will know what other superhero movies have come out. But at the very least, I'll be covering New Mutants and The Old Guard. And if any other superhero movies hit before the end of the year, then I'll cover that as well in December. And I've got two new collaborative novels that are out now as this is live. A science fiction novel with David Sherman called To Hell and Regroup, which is the third book in David's military science fiction trilogy. It's about an alien invasion of a human colony. David wrote the first two books, and I was actually the editor on those. I still do a lot of freelance editing. I started out as an editor for the first 8 or 9 years of my career, working for Byron Price. And then when I went freelance, I still do editorial work. And I edited David's first two books. For various health reasons, he was unable to finish the third book, so he asked me to work on it with him. So that's from both of us. There's also an omnibus of all three books called The 18th Race. I also have a thriller out, which is just out now as this goes live, with Dr. Manish K. Batra, which is called Animal. It's about a serial killer who targets people who harm animals. It's kind of Dexter if it had been created by PETA. And that's out now from Wordfire Press. I am working in 2021. I plan to have the next books in my urban fantasy series, The Bram Gold Adventures, which will be called Feet of Clay. The first book is called A Furnace Sealed, and that came out from Wordfire Press in 2019. It's about a guy from the Bronx who hunts monsters for a living. And then I've also got my high fantasy police procedural series, which started with Dragon Precinct. And I've written 5 novels. Besides Dragon Precinct, there's Unicorn Precinct, Goblin Precinct, Griffin Precinct, and Mermaid Precinct. The next book is Phoenix Precinct, which also should be out in 2021. There's also a short story collection called Tales from Dragon Precinct, and I've got at least 2 more books after this, including another collection called More Tales from Dragon Precinct, and a 7th novel called Manticore Precinct. So, and I've got stories in a lot of anthologies coming out, and that are out, and lots of other cool stuff. Again, DeCandido.net is where to go to keep up with me. So.
Okay, well,
I think that's everything.
If there's more, I will be shocked even more. But I still think that you're in some other time dimension where you have more time in the day. But I will, for anybody who's listening, I will make sure that I will link up to Keith's website as well as a few of his novels and that, so you can find those in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com. So if you're listening to this right now, you can just head over to dicegeeks.com. You will find in the show notes for this episode, I will provide links so you can find and learn more about Keith's writing. And I'm still just amazed that you can watch all of that stuff, because I don't have time to watch Jack, like hardly at all. So I am amazed by that, Keith. But I just do want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I could talk about Star Trek and writing and Andromeda for hours and hours on end. And so it was just a pleasure to get to speak with you today. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Oh, it was my pleasure. I really enjoyed it. Thank you for having me on.
All right, there you have it, guys. Oh, man, it was just a ton of fun being able to talk to Keith. Any day I get to talk about Star Trek, Andromeda, novel writing, role-playing games is an awesome day in my book. So as I mentioned in the interview, I have provided links in the show notes for this episode at dicegeeks.com to a ton of Keith's books, as well as his own website. And also be sure to check out his novel called Animal. It is a new release. I have a link for it there in the show notes as well, so you can check that out. Now, if you want some free stuff, head over to dicegeeks.com/free. You'll get 10 free dungeon maps. Plus, you'll never miss an episode of this show. And each and every Friday, you will get an email update from me letting you know what is going on in this world that I call Dice Geeks. Now, hey guys, if you like this show at all, please consider supporting it in some way. You can like, subscribe, rate, review wherever you are listening to this podcast. You can also share it with a friend, tweet about it, post on Facebook, whatever you do. You can also support the show financially at patreon.com/dicegeeks. Any support is greatly appreciated. Now, I thank you so much for listening, and until next Wednesday, keep gaming.